Hello students, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Khushbu Mahajan and I am working as a research associate in the Department of Political Science, Punjab University, and I am also teaching in the Institute for Social Sciences and Research in the same university. Today we are going to talk about the module Process of Globalization, Implications for Indian Politics. World has become a global village. In the context of globalization, modern technology has transformed the world. It has in fact shrunk the world. It has given a new boundaries to the world. In fact, the world has become a small village. In this context, we have discussed the views of Marxist thinkers as well as the liberalist thinkers. Both the thinkers, both the Marxists as well as the liberals, are of the view that globalization has posed a serious threat to the nation state, in fact the sovereignty of the state. But in this context, Marxists believe that there is an alternative paradigm to curb this menace. But on the other hand, both the thinkers, Marxists as well as the liberalists, they have the view that to curb this menace and to release the threat of the globalization, we need to strengthen our political institutions and democratic institutions so as the threat of the capitalist class should be decreased on the nation state. After getting independence on 15th August 1947, there was a major challenge in front of the leaders of freedom struggle to chalk out the strategy and to plan for smooth functioning of Indian state. There were many ideological currents working for planning the future course of action for India. No other thinkers in modern nationalist tradition could match Gandhi and Tagore in intellectual significance. Yet paradoxically, the political imagination of independent India, both of the elite and of subaltern groups, turned decisively in an opposite direction. Their ideas were accorded a hollow reverence, which actually political reasoning fell deeper into, and abiding in enchantment by the state. Gandhi brought independence to India, but it was Nehru, an entirely unrepentant modernist, who obtained the historical opportunity to decide what to do with that independence and how the powers of newly acquired sovereignty should be used. Impact of globalization on national sovereignty. Scholars have argued in two different directions on this issue. First batch of scholars have argued that in the era of globalization, because of the mounting pressure from international financial institutions and international market, India has liberalized its economy. In this process, the sovereignty of the state is eroding, and the second batch of scholars have argued that in the phase of globalization, the state has become stronger. To understand the position, we can divide the Indian development strategy into three phases. Phase 1, the phase of Indian statist policy regime. Phase 2 is the phase of Indian authoritarian tinge in the late 1970s, and phase 3 is the phase of neoliberal economic reforms, and we'll discuss these reforms in these phases. The phase of the Indian statist policy regime. In an attempt to fulfill the aspirations of Indian state to industrialize and develop faster, initially the greater emphasis was laid on the public sector. When Mahalanobis was given the charge of preparing the model of planning, and he was in favor of single sector model, but later in 1953 he developed a model with two sectors. When Nehru-Mahalanobis model initiated, the 5-year planning and the state intervention were dominant themes on the economic and political scenes. There is continuity in the formulation and implementation of the first three plans due to Nehru's personal commitment. Due to the overwhelming support commanded by the Congress Party, India also enjoyed political stability at the center. It was because of the leaders of Indian National Congress who also fought for independence. People had the natural regard for those leaders who were the freedom fighters like Nehru, Patel, Pant, Azad, Rajendra Prasad, and others. The first 5-year plan, that was from 1951 to 1956, and the second, that was from 1956 to 61, first 5-year plans aimed at growth rate of 5% per annum, but did not achieve the target, and it was around the average of 3.5%. Although it was below the target, it was too low, keeping in view the two wars, the year of wars from 1962 and 1965, which India fought in this period. The growth was well accepted and it was very impressive. But in this era, India did really had a command economy. The nature of planning was adapted to India's centralized parliamentary federal democratic state. It can be considered a pre-globalization phase. National sovereignty of the state was intact. There was no compromise made on this front. Second phase was the phase of Indian authoritarian tinge in the late 1970s, making statism fight absolute poverty. There was a break in planning process during 1966 and 69, which was a period of plan holiday. The regular planning was substituted by 3 somewhat ad hoc annual plans, 1966 to 69. Planning was then resumed with even more ambitious targets in fourth 5-year plan in 1969, covering the period of 1969 to 74. The discontinuity of 5-year plans was due to the external shocks, that is the rise of international oil prices, the strain caused by the birth of Bangladesh, and the bad harvest that set the stage for a major crisis in 1973 to 75. Meanwhile, there was a significant change in the political scene and the decline in the sense of optimism with which the first to 5-year plans had been greeted. The fifth 5-year plan was not completed because of the change of party in power in 1977. The average rate growth in GDP for the period 66 to 77 was 3.5%. India's developmental performance during the first phase of Indira Gandhi's regime was adversely affected by at least 2 features of the politics of this period. These were the increasing electoral pressures emanating from the political arrival of the peasantry, particularly the middle castes of the peasant cultivators, as a result of ruralizing elections that crossed the critical threshold by the 4th general elections in 1967. And second, the gathering momentum of mass movement organized first in Gujarat by Morarji Desai and later in Bihar, with wider geographical spread across the major northern and western states, started by the student and non-Congress opposition that drafted the socialist turned Gandhian Jayaprakash Narayan from virtual political retirement to offer overarching leadership to these movements. They were subsequently joined by some trade unions and Hindus and Sikh right-wing forces. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi managed to checkmate and appropriate the newly emergent peasantry through populist electoral mobilization by the Congress party, remodeled in her own image, but the containment of the pressures from the mass movements and a sizable section of unionized Indian Railways men who staged a nationwide strike in 1974 proved to be a more difficult proposition. The new strategy of electoral mobilization was attempted by Indira Gandhi by assuming a more progressive pro-poor ideological posture by splitting her own party in 1969 and forcing the right-wing Old Guard syndicate faction out. They formed a separate party called Congress O organization that emerged as the first officially recognized opposition party in Lok Sabha by the virtue of its size. In a swift move, Mrs. Gandhi nationalized 14 major private commercial banks, abolished the privy purses of the former princely rulers, and proceeded to have a snap midterm poll in 1971 on the catchy slogan of Garibi Hatao, which she won hands down. But this spectacular electoral success was not without concomitant costs. Her adventure was to make a direct personal appeal to the masses, bypassing the intermediate structures of the Congress Party and federal autonomy of the state governments. Populist politics, if somewhat undemocratic, was progressive in a way, but overturned the rationalist calculations of economic planning. Scarce resources were diverted on partisan and personal preferences to electorally profitable but economically unproductive expenditures and channels. That was the beginning of the division of huge amount of revenue to subsidies and loans on economically irrational and unfeasible banking security considerations. The post-emergency 1977 elections ushered a new phase in Indian politics. This phase started with the first non-Congress government in New Delhi, formed by Janata Party, which restored the democratic features of the constitution by enacting the 44th constitutional amendment, dismantling the authoritarian features earlier introduced by the 42nd amendment passed by emergency regime. It also made a shift to the larger plan investment in the rural sector. Its premature fall in 1979 resulted in restoration of the Congress Party to power in 1980, led in this decade first by Indira Gandhi and subsequently by Rajiv Gandhi, which in turn was followed by Janata Party-led National Front government, the Congress minority government led by P.V. Narasimha Rao, Janata Party-led National Front government, Bharatiya Janata Party-led NDA government, and the Congress-led UPA government. I am clubbing these periods together because all these governments either initiated or accelerated neoliberal economic reforms and pursued these policies with varying pace, despite their divergent positions and policies on the cultural issues. For example, secularism versus cultural nationalism, which is euphemism of Hindu communalism. When we analyze the economic indicators of these periods, we find a consistent growth of an average of 5% despite the changes in political scenario and a brief period of emergency. Agriculture did not do well, but industry and service were growing much faster in the post-liberalization period. And the third phase, the phase of neoliberal economic reforms. The period between 90s and 91 was characterized as very crucial one. The climatic crisis resulted from a near bankruptcy early 1991, and one can identify some forces beyond the control of Indian planners that triggered it. The 80s witnessed the turning point in many of the socialist economies with a strong link to India. The Congress Party under Rajiv Gandhi had lost in momentum, and the political system at the center faced serious tension due to lack of leadership. The economic and political situation was very grim. The inflation was 12% a year and rising. The current account deficit was about $10 billion. All the economic indicators were showing warning signals. Against this background, in 1991, the minority Congress government of P.V. Narasimha Rao took the charge. Dr. Manmohan Singh, a distinguished economist, was made the finance minister. He started an era of neoliberal economic reforms, marked by the radical departure from the past policies. The new government immediately sought standby loan from IMF, that is International Monetary Fund, and devalued the rupee. These actions were followed by Dr. Manmohan Singh's first budget, which laid out what was, in the Indian context, a radical strategy for stabilizing the economy and reducing the budget deficit, and by policies which promised structural adjustment. This was a turning point in Indian economic history. The process of economic liberalization started. The market forces were given relatively free hand in the steering some vital sectors of the economy of the country, and this vital change in the scenario created an opening for a major reorientation in the strategy of economic development. It significantly started the process of gradual transformation of Indian state from its role as a bureaucratic state to a regulatory state. While the state sector was not entirely dismantled, there was a comprehensive policy to accelerate the process of bureaucratic deregulation, privatization, and globalization. In this shift in the policy paradigm, there appeared new possibility of a renegotiated partnership between a state playing a reduced regulatory role as a facilitator of economic development in partnership with the market. In service delivery and socio-economic change, the voluntary sector or the non-government organizations in the civil society were also invited to play an important role. By the year 2000 and beyond, the post-reform scenario shows that the service sector of Indian economy has grown faster than the industrial and agriculture sectors. The basic growth data pertaining to 1980s to 2008 show that the GDP growth rate averaging 6.2, service sector at 7.5 is ahead of the two basic sectors, industrial sector at 6.7, agriculture sector at 3.5. In terms of overall sectoral composition of the economy today, the contribution of service sector in GDP exceeds 50%, the remainder being shared by other two sectors at more or less 25% each. One of the major failures of the economic reforms has been that this lopsided growth has not been made more balanced in three respective sectors. Another major problem has been the failure of the growth to create more employment. A major complaint of the advocates of the reform has been the absence of any effort to bring about labor law reforms, which said to be hampering productivity and growth. However, this seems to be only the half story, as informal measures like not filling the vacancies through regular employment and recourse to contract and casual jobs have transformed the workforce considerably. In addition, without any formal amendment in the labor laws, the trade union movement has also been considerably weakened through the executive and judicial actions. Moreover, the reforms so far have succeeded in bringing about a good deal of bureaucratic deregulation than expanding international trade or bringing in expected foreign direct investment, that is FDI. Further economic reforms have favored the big corporate sectors much more significantly than the medium and small industries. We can see from this discussion India had to sacrifice on many counts. The impact of globalization can be seen on its economy. In 1980s, India was compelled to liberalize its economy under pressure of IMF and World Bank and WTO, that is World Trade Organization. India had to sacrifice its sovereignty because of economic compulsions. It introduced neoliberal economic reforms. Now, I will analyze the impact of globalization on Indian state from liberal and Marxist perspective. Liberal interpretation of the impact of globalization on Indian states. Academic interpretation of the Indian state in pre-globalization phase, both in its liberal and Marxist version, clearly maintained that Indian state was autonomous from its class base. Liberals like Rajni Kothari and Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph believed that the state stood above the societal conflicts, playing the role of an independent mediator or arbiter of the conflicting interest or pressure groups. The liberals particularly highlight the framework of constitutionally granted fundamental rights to individuals and groups in the society and the promissory directive principles of the state policy in constitution towards providing common framework of citizenship and social securities to the unemployed, women, children and older people as well as the needy and the poor sections of the society. They also draw attention to the regulatory of the free and fair elections within the competitive party system. Even though initially the Indian Congress remained a predominant party, both at the state level until the late 1970s. Moreover, liberals also emphasized the independence of the judiciary and the existence of the free press. The Rudolphs also noted a trend of political deinstitutionalization in India in post-Nehruvian era. To quote them, deinstitutionalization accompanied Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's attempts between 1969 and 1984 to centralize the power in her own hands. They also observed that Indian state, which operated with considerable autonomy from its social base until now, tended to its come under increasing societal pressure, constraining its autonomous functioning. The neo-Marxist interpretations of the Indian state by Pranab Bardhan, Anupam Sen and Achin Vinayak also broadly agreed that neither the class of capitalists nor the class of workers, the two major classes of the fundamental importance in an industrial and industrializing society, had emerged in India to be so powerful as to dominate the state. Pranab Bardhan argued that given the tradition of strong state in Mughal and British India, the civil society was relatively weak in relation to the overdeveloped state in feudal and colonial period. Thus, the state in independent India began its life as a relatively autonomous actor. He also noted that in the decades between 50s and 70s, the Indian state acquired direct ownership and the control of industrial economy to an unprecedented extent in history. This was the result of the state-directed strategy of planned economic development under Prime Minister Nehru and his immediate successors. Bardhan theorized the existence of three dominant proprietary classes in Indian political economy: industrial bourgeois, rich farmers, and professionals in civilian and military bureaucracy beside the political class. A class coalition of these three proprietary groups managed the Indian state, neither of which exclusively controlled the state due to the prevailing plurality and heterogeneity of the interest represented. To Bardhan, these conflicts adversely affected rational and efficient surplus, capital accumulation, and public management. However, the dominant proprietary classes found it extremely difficult to take collective action on the account of the large and heterogeneous class coalitions they were constrained to operate. The result was fiscal crisis and the overload on the state that culminated into the neoliberal economic reforms in piecemeal ways since the mid-1980s and the acceleration of the process of the shift to a new economic policy regime, especially in 1991, to tide over the balance of payment crisis. In the epilogue added to the 1988 edition of Bardhan's Political Economy of Development, it is noted that the most vocal opposition to reform came from the Indian business houses and the organized labor. He also notes that the reaction of the farmers and the blue collar workers was rather muted due to their highly fragmented nature. What has been the impact of globalization on Indian state? Social scientists and political economists in India have generally argued that globalization has adversely impacted the autonomy and independence of the sovereign nation state. This trend of analysis is more or less common across the ideological divisions, broadly reflected in liberal as well as Marxist analysis. The difference, if any, is only in the terms of degree. Marxist interpretation of the impact of globalization on Indian state. Prabhat Patnaik and C.P. Chandrasekhar. While the liberal interpretation of this phenomenon largely focuses on the deepening crisis of the Indian democracy in terms of political deinstitutionalization and the growing fiscal overload on the national state, Marxist political economists like Prabhat Patnaik and C.P. Chandrasekhar draw attention to both factors of global capitalism and Indian national economy and the national state actors. As to the role of Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF and World Bank, Patnaik and Chandrasekhar argue that traditionally there was significant difference of approach between the two, which subsequently narrowed over time with the significant consequences for the contemporary political economy. The World Bank has always been opposed to any attempts on the part of the third world countries to break away from the pattern of international division of labor inherited from the days of colonialism and semi-colonialism. However, IMF was not so much bothered about the considerations of blocking the attempts of national economies for remodeling or restructuring the international division of labor between developed industrial and developing industrializing economies. It was mainly concerned with fiscal stabilization. Following the two major oil shocks of the late 1960s and early 1970s, the two major Bretton Woods talks moved closer to each other in terms of their outlooks. This change was promoted by a significant extent by the vastly enhanced role of globalized finance. This was brought about, among others, the breaking down of what would have called the inter-imperialist rivalry vis-à-vis the Third World. The advanced capitalist countries, as a result, present a remarkably common front and give a more or less unanimous support to the structural adjustment measures being imposed by the Bretton Woods institutions, frustrating any attempt by the third world economies in favor of dirigiste, that is, the state directed economic development. Now, there is all out support for market against the state all over the world. Do we have any alternative in contrast to most analysts who seem to think we have none? Patnaik and Chandrasekhar offer an alternative policy paradigm, not in the imitation of the neo-mercantilist strategy espoused by the East Asian economies prior to their financial liberalization. Southeast Asian economies were liberal, including in the sphere of finance all along. That strategy of the developmental state would not work in India because India is a democratic developmental state, in contrast to general authoritarian developmental states of East Asia. To quote Patnaik and Chandrasekhar, specifically for economies like India, this means that the volatility of the financial flows has to be kept under check through a combination of direct regulations, second, an overall sound balance of payment in relative terms, which is not synonymous with the neo-mercantilism, and above all, third, the developmental strategy that ensures the economy with social stability and hence with equity and distributive justice. The implication is that India's economic strategy of promoting market-led growth must be coupled with the strengthening of the democratic institutions. Capitalist growth with the democratic development will introduce a dialectics between external dimension of the global capitalism and internal dimension of democratic mobilization of the basic classes at the home, namely workers, both organized and unorganized sectors, and the bulk of the peasantry. The purpose of this module was to focus and to emphasize over the implications of globalization over the Indian state. And we have discussed that it has posed really many threats on Indian sovereignty, and there are various views of different thinkers over it. To encapsulate that, we can say that since the inception of the democracy, Indian state has faced many political, social and economic problems, but it has faced those problems very boldly, and it has come up and stood out perfectly and relatively in a good manner from all those challenges. And this is required that the democratic institutions in the country must be strengthened so as to curb the menace of globalization and to curb the negative impacts of the globalization on India.